The ship at the edge of the viewport should not have existed. Commander Elena Reyes had spent the last 6 months learning to recognize every silhouette humanity's engineers had thrown together out of scavenged assembly wreckage and pure stubbornness, and she had spent the 6 months before that learning the profile of every Osaic and Vorathi hull the assembly had sent against Sol. She knew the blunt, bronze-black angles of a harvest cruiser. She knew the high armored collar of a Vorathi warplate flagship. She had learned both shapes the way a person learns the sound of their own heartbeat, without meaning to, simply by surviving long enough near them. The ship drifting at the very edge of long-range sensors, 3 weeks after the retreat of Fleet Marshal Kozal's shattered fleet, matched neither. It was smaller than an assembly harvest cruiser, sleeker than anything the Vorathi had ever fielded, its hull a matte, non-reflective black that seemed to drink in the starlight around it rather than catch it. It carried no visible weapon ports. It carried no visible engines, no exhaust trail, no heat bloom that any human sensor operator had ever been trained to look for. It simply hung there at the exact edge of detection, doing nothing at all except being watched. "Talk to me," Reyes said, standing at the observation deck of the newly commissioned Sol Defense Initiative Command Station, a converted orbital platform humanity had built in the 11 weeks since the second contact engagement, using pieces of the 11 assembly ships that hadn't made it home. "I don't have anything good to tell you," said the sensor officer at the console beside her, a young man named Petrov, who had, like most of the technical staff aboard the station, been a civilian radar engineer 8 months earlier. "It's not broadcasting an assembly transponder code. It's not broadcasting anything. If Dr. Osei's translation matrix is right, and it usually is, this isn't even built using assembly hull architecture. The angles are wrong. The material signature is wrong. Whatever this is, Commander, it isn't Osaic and it isn't Vorathi." Dr. Amara Osei arrived on the observation deck 11 minutes later, out of breath, a data slate already glowing in her hand, and the first thing she said was not a greeting. "It's been there for 6 hours," she said. "It hasn't moved. It hasn't transmitted. And it is not the only one." She turned the slate toward Reyes. The display showed the edge of the Sol system, a scattering of pale blue dots marking the outer debris field left behind by Kozal's retreat, and drifting among them 7 more of the same matte black silhouettes, spaced with a precision that made Reyes' skin crawl. 7 ships, Reese said, just sitting there. 8, Osei corrected, including the one on our sensors. "And Elena, I need you to understand something about what I'm looking at, because I've spent the last 3 weeks with nothing to do but stare at every piece of assembly data we scavenged, and none of it has a category for this. Before we go any further, if you've been with this series since episode 1, thank you for sticking around, and if you're new, welcome. Hit subscribe now so you don't lose your place in this story. I want to know what you think that fleet is, human, assembly, or something we haven't even heard of yet. Drop your guess in the comments before we find out together. Now, back to the story. The 9th Council of the Threshold Assembly had not stopped meeting in emergency session since Fleet Marshal Kozal's retreat, though the tone of those sessions had changed considerably in 3 weeks. Where the first 2 emergency councils had been dominated by disbelief and quiet embarrassment, the third had settled into something colder and far more dangerous, calculation. "The Varathi will not accept another failure," said the representative of the Drasa Combine, a species whose entire trade economy had been built on the assumption that pre-warp worlds surrendered quickly and profitably, and who had watched that assumption cost them more in 11 months than in the previous millennium combined. Kozau has been recalled for review. There is already talk of a third fleet, larger than the first two combined. A third fleet built on the same doctrine that failed twice will fail a third time, said Theskvan, the Elkarish diplomat whose warnings had gone unheeded before both previous engagements. She did not raise her voice. She had learned across 3 council sessions that raising her voice only made the chamber more comfortable, dismissing her. Quiet, measured words left less room for that comfort. You cannot out-escalate a species that escalates faster than you can build ships to send against it. Every fleet you lose teaches them something new. Every month you spend building the next one. They spend building 2. Then what do you propose, diplomat? The Drasa representative's voice carried the particular edge of a species watching its economic model collapse in real time. That we simply abandon Sol? Concede a Tier 7 world to a species that has now destroyed or driven off 2 assembly fleets? I propose, Theskvan said, that the 9th Council stop asking how to defeat them and start asking what they will become if we do not. Because I do not believe defeat is a realistic outcome any longer, and I think several of you know that even if none of you are willing to say it in this chamber. The chamber's silence this time was not the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of a room slowly, reluctantly, beginning to agree with something it did not want to be true. It was into that silence that a 9th voice spoke, one that had not been heard in any 9th Council session in over 4 centuries. A voice belonging to a seat that had sat empty and unclaimed for so long that most of the current Council's representatives had assumed it would remain that way permanently. If I may, the voice said, translated into the chamber's common tongue by a system that flagged the original language as belonging to no catalogued assembly member species. I believe I can answer the diplomat's question. I have, after all, been watching this particular experiment unfold with considerable interest. Every representative in the chamber turned toward the 9th seat and found it, for the first time in 400 years, occupied. The being who had claimed the 9th seat introduced itself through the translation system only as an observer, a designation the assembly database confirmed belonged to a species that had held permanent, non-voting membership in the Threshold Assembly since its founding 11,000 years earlier, a founding member so ancient and so rarely present that most council representatives had genuinely believed the seat to be ceremonial, a relic of a species long extinct. It was not extinct. It had simply, according to the sparse assembly records that existed on the matter, chosen not to attend in person for 4 centuries, content to let its permanent observer status sit unused while the younger member species conducted the business of governing known space. Theskvan, who had spent decades of her long diplomatic career studying the founding charter of the Assembly more closely than perhaps any other living representative, was one of the few in the chamber who did not look surprised. "You've been watching Sol," she said. It was not a question. "I have been watching Sol since 3 days after the Assaic scout vessel first drifted into the system," the observer said. "I watch every new intelligent species this assembly discovers, diplomat. It is in the oldest and simplest sense of the word my purpose. I do not vote. I do not intervene. I observe, and when observation is complete, I report my findings to whichever council happens to be in session at the time. A pause, one that felt, even through translation, deliberate. I believe observation of this particular species is now complete, or complete enough to warrant my presence here. And your findings? The Drasse representative asked, some of his earlier bravado already draining out of his voice. You have spent 3 council sessions asking each other how to stop them, the observer said. I would like to suggest that this is the wrong question, and has been the wrong question since the moment the first Assaic scout logged its threat assessment 11 months ago. The correct question, the only question that has ever mattered where this species is concerned, is not how to stop them. It is how to survive having found them at all. Back in the Sol system, the 8 matte black vessels had not moved in 11 hours, and Elena Reyes had run out of patience 3 hours earlier. I want eyes on that ship, she told the assembled command staff of the Sol Defense Initiative, gathered in the same converted mountain briefing room where, 11 months earlier, humanity's first interceptors had been unveiled. Not sensors, not long-range scans. I want a physical reconnaissance flight, close enough to get visual confirmation on hull markings, weapon systems, anything that tells us what we're actually looking at. That's a significant risk, Commander, said General Marcus Hawley, the officer who had, in the chaos of the last year, become the closest thing the fractured, still informal Sol Defense Initiative had to an overall military commander. We don't know if that ship is hostile. We don't know if it's assembly. We don't know anything about it, which is exactly the argument for staying well clear of it until we do. We don't know anything about it, because it's sitting at the edge of our system doing absolutely nothing for 11 hours straight, Reyes said. That's not the behavior of a scout fleet preparing an attack. Scouts gather intelligence and leave. This thing is just sitting there, watching us, the same way it's apparently been watching everything else in this system for who knows how long. I'd rather know what's watching us than keep flying blind. Dr. Asay, seated at the far end of the briefing table, had been quiet through most of the exchange, her attention fixed on a data slate that had been updating steadily since the 8-ship formation first appeared. There's something else, she said finally. Something I haven't mentioned because I wasn't sure how to say it without sounding like I finally cracked under the workload. Say it anyway, Reyes told her. The formation those 8 ships are holding, Asay said, turning her slate around to display a schematic overlay. It isn't random, and it isn't a standard assembly defensive pattern, either. I've checked it against everything in Vaisruk's stolen archive. It's a shape, a very specific, very old shape, according to a fragment of translated text, buried in a section of the archive. I almost didn't bother opening because the file was labeled, near as I can translate it, as ceremonial or historical rather than tactical. What shape? General Hawley asked. Asay looked up from the slate, and for the first time since the second contact engagement, Reyes saw something on her friend's face that wasn't exhaustion or calculation, but something closer to genuine unease. It's a watch formation, Asay said. The oldest reference I can find to it in the archive is nearly 9,000 years old, described as a configuration used by something the Assembly's own ancient records refer to only as the Founders. I don't know what that means yet. But I know it's not a Varathi formation, and it's not a Saic, and whatever it is, it's been sitting in Assembly historical records for 9,000 years, without anyone bothering to explain what it actually is. Quick pause here. Because if you're the kind of person who likes putting pieces together before the story tells you the answer, now's your moment. Drop a comment with your theory on who the Founder's Eye actually is, and stick around, because General Hale's reconnaissance flight is about to answer at least part of that question. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time, because Episode 4 is going to need every one of you paying close attention. Back to it? The reconnaissance flight launched 4 hours later. A single modified interceptor stripped of weapons and loaded instead with every passive sensor. Humanity's engineers had been able to scavenge, reverse engineer, or build from scratch in the 11 months since first contact. Reyes flew it herself over General Hale's strong objection, because, as she put it, she was not about to send someone else's pilot toward something she wasn't willing to approach herself. The approach took 90 minutes at cautious burn, the matte black vessel growing from a sensor ghost into an actual, physical shape against the stars, and the closer Reyes got, the less it looked like anything she had learned to associate with the assembly at all. There were no visible seams in the hull. No visible plating, no visible weapon ports, no visible engines. It looked, if anything, less like a constructed vessel, and more like a single solid piece of something that had simply been shaped into the form of a ship, smooth and unbroken and utterly silent. "Command, this is Hornet Actual," Reyes said, her voice carefully leveled despite the tightness in her chest. "I have visual on the target. I'm not reading any active systems. No thermal signature, no active sensors pinging my hull. Nothing. It's just sitting here. Copy. Hornet Actual. Continue approach. Maintain passive scan only." Reyes eased the interceptor closer, close enough now that the black hull filled most of her forward viewport, close enough to see, for the first time, a single detail that broke the vessel's otherwise perfect, featureless surface. A faint pattern etched into the hull near what might have been a bow, a series of concentric circles surrounding a single point, rendered in a material that caught no light at all, visible only as a slightly different texture against the surrounding black. "Command, I've got something. A marking on the hull. Sending visual now." The image reached Dr. Osei's terminal aboard the command station 40 seconds later, and the reaction it produced was immediate and, to everyone watching, deeply unsettling, because Amara Osei, who had spent 11 months translating an alien language from scratch under the worst possible conditions, and had never once, in all that time, looked frightened in front of the command staff, went very quiet, very still, and did not answer the first 2 times General Halley asked her what she was looking at. "Amara," Reyes said over the comm, her own voice tightening. "Talk to me." "It's the same symbol," Osei said finally. "The same one from the Founder's Eye reference in the archive. Concentric circles around a single point. I thought it was decorative. I thought it was some kind of ceremonial marking that didn't actually mean anything tactically important." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something just above a whisper. "Elena, I don't think it's decorative. I think it's a designation. I think that symbol is what the Founders called themselves, and I think we've just found direct physical proof that whatever the Founder's Eye actually is, it isn't a myth buried in old assembly records. It's real, and it's been sitting at the edge of our solar system for at least 11 hours, watching us." Reyes brought the interceptor to a full stop, close enough now to the alien vessel that the 2 ships hung motionless relative to each other against the stars, close enough that if the black ship had any hostile intent at all, There would be nothing Reyes could do to evade whatever came next. Nothing came. For nearly 6 minutes the two vessels simply hung there, human and unknown, close enough to touch, and nothing happened at all. No weapons fire, no communication, no visible reaction of any kind from the featureless black hull. Reyes had time in those 6 minutes to consider every possible reason a species old enough to hold a founding, permanent, unclaimed seat in the assembly might choose to simply watch a young, violent, unpredictable species fight off two increasingly desperate invasion attempts without ever once intervening or making contact. None of the reasons she came up with made her feel better. It was the 7th minute that changed everything. A voice reached Reyes's cockpit, not through any radio frequency her instruments had been tuned to receive, not through the jury-rigged assembly translation relay Osei's team had built from scavenged wreckage, but through something that felt impossibly like it was arriving directly in her own mind, clear and calm and entirely without the mechanical distortion every other alien transmission had carried. "You have been watched since the beginning," the voice said. "Not by the ones who came to harvest you, though they watched as well in their own limited way. You have been watched by us since long before the assembly you know existed, since long before the species who built it had learned to walk upright on their own worlds. We do not intervene in the affairs of young species. We have never intervened, not once, in 11,000 years of this assembly's history, no matter how badly some of its members deserved it. But we have never, in all that time, watched a species do what yours has just done. We have watched 1,000 young civilizations discover the wider galaxy. We have watched most of them fracture under the weight of that discovery, and a few of them rise to meet it. We have never watched one arrive at both outcomes at once, fractured by war against itself for the entirety of its recorded history, and yet somehow the moment it finally faced something worth uniting against, capable of setting 11,000 years of internal conflict aside within a single afternoon. We do not know yet what that means for the shape of things to come, but we intend to find out. And so, Commander Elena Reyes, we have a question for your species, one this Assembly's 9th Council is entirely unprepared to answer honestly, because they have spent the last 11 months asking each other how to stop you, when the only question that has ever mattered is whether you can be trusted with what you are about to become. The voice paused, and in the silence that followed, Reyes realized her hands had gone still on the flight controls, her breath held without her noticing. "What do you intend to become once you have finished proving to us that you cannot be destroyed?" The transmission ended as abruptly as it had begun, and Reyes sat alone in her cockpit for a long moment, the black vessel still motionless in front of her, giving no further sign that anything had happened at all. "Command," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "Did anyone else copy that?" The silence that answered her told her everything she needed to know. Whatever had just spoken to her had spoken to her alone, directly, in a way no instrument on the command station had been able to detect or record. She brought the interceptor around and began the long burn back toward the Soul Defense Initiative command station, the black vessel and its 7 companions receding behind her, still motionless, still silent, still watching. By the time she landed, word of what had happened, relayed through her own account rather than any recording, had already reached General Hall, Dr. Osei, and the small, informal council of human military and civilian leadership that had, over the course of 11 months become the closest thing humanity had to a unified response to first contact. An ancient founding species has been watching us since before the assembly existed, General Halley said, once Reyes had finished recounting the message word for word, and their entire evaluation of whether we deserve to keep existing comes down to what we do next. That's the short version. Yes, Reyes said. And you have no idea what they're actually asking us to prove, Osei added. Whether we become something worth trusting or something worth fearing. And I don't think they're going to tell us which answer they're hoping for. I think that might be the entire point. Far beyond the edge of the solar system, the 8 vessels of the Founder's Eye held their ancient, patient formation, exactly as they had for 11 hours, exactly as Reyes now understood. Some part of them had been holding since long before any human being had looked up at the night sky and wondered whether anyone was looking back. They were not preparing to attack. They were waiting to see what humanity would build next, now that it finally understood it was being watched by something far older, far more patient, and far more consequential than either the Osaic Dominion or the Vorathi war fleet had ever been. And on the surface of Earth, in shipyards carved into 3 different mountain ranges, humanity's next generation of warships continued rising out of scaffolding and steel, unaware for now that the question that would decide their species' place in the galaxy had already been asked. It simply hadn't been answered yet. If you thought discovering the assembly was the strangest thing that could happen to humanity in its first year among the stars, you were wrong, and so was Commander Reyes, standing in that cockpit with a voice in her head that belonged to something older than the civilization currently trying to destroy her planet. Because the Founder's Eye was never the end of this story. It was only the moment humanity finally learned it had an audience. Next time on The Rise of Earth, Episode 4, Earth's Secret Weapon. You are not going to believe what the Soul Defense Initiative has been building in secret this entire time, hidden even from its own command staff. And you are definitely not going to believe why they kept it hidden from the one person who needed to know about it most. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this one. It's one of my favorites in the series so far. If you enjoyed Episode 3, let me know in the comments what you think the Founder's Eye actually wants from humanity. I read every single one of them. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss Episode 4 the moment it drops. And if you want early access right now, the join link is below. Until next time, this has been Nova Archives. Stay curious. Stay human.